All rise, we would be. The International Criminal Court is now in session. L'audience au Cour pénale internationale est ouverte. Please be seated. We will assoir. Good morning, everyone. Mr. Court Officer, would you kindly call the case?
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honours. This is the second situation in the Central African Republic, the case of the prosecutor versus Maxim Geoffroy Eli Mokom Gawaka, case reference ICC 0114-0122, and for the record, we are in open session.
Thank you very much. Just for the records, I would ask parties and participants just to, if there's any change in the, or just say it again, who is present, just for the records of your team. Mr. Prosecutor.
Mr. President, Your Honours, good morning. Our office is represented exactly by the same team as yesterday. To my left, Leonie Van Braun, Colin Gilk, and behind me, Madame Nerani Mandavia, Madame Marie-Jeanne Sardaki, Mr. Mathieu Costi, Mr. Lucio Garcia, and Sandra Scully. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Rochelle, s'il vous plaît.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président, Madame.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honours. The defense bench is represented by exactly the same team. Mr. Mokom is present. And I correct one name, Madame Dive, not Madame Dive. And then we have two interns, Fanny de Canoë to my left, and behind me, Baptiste Burry. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Common representative of victims.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. The legal representatives of victims team remains the same as yesterday. There's been no change.
Thank you very much. The composition of the chamber is unchanged. Now we will then continue with the submissions on the merits of the common legal representative of victims. You are left with 99 minutes overall. So the floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Your Honor. My colleagues of the team of the legal representatives of the victims of the crimes have asked me to address you first for this hearing, for this morning's session. And then, following my observations, my colleague, Mr. Moussa Dangabo, will follow. Your Honor, Your Honors, this case, if we look at it close up, is in reality but a sequence in a situation we already know too well in the Central African Republic, with one difference about the geographical and temporal dimensions of this case. As the prosecutor recalled yesterday, we are just about certain that if the investigations had taken place at the same time, we could have had a joint trial with the other case that is now underway. So we could have simply reread the statements made at the time before the pre-trial Chamber 5. However, in the interim, the road has been long in these proceedings, and this has enabled us to be facing reality and learn more about what has happened. Under our mandate, we, the legal representatives of the victims, have been called upon to be a physical contact, a direct and ongoing contact with the field. And this position has made us ultimately a receiver for reactions of victims who, all in all, have a central role in the functioning of the court. The victims are indeed at the beginning, the middle, and at the end of the process. Indisputably, they make up a reservoir in which all the parties, without exception, will be gleaning resources to make this machine function. Without their cooperation, their availability, their depositions, and other statements, it is a certain fact that the system would have ground to a halt and would have had great difficulties. This very central place being occupied by our clients within the court system has been enshrined not just by the founding texts, but also by the professions of faith, which we have continued to hear coming from the voices of those who have the most authority to make such statements. During the 25th commemoration of the adoption of the Rome Statute on 17 July last, Madame Fernandez de Gourmande, President of the Assembly of States Parties, stated the following, and I quote, "The need for the court to continue work in order to attain the level of a court that is worth having, a universal and inclusive court that can achieve high-caliber justice, guaranteeing the central role of victims." With respect to us, we essentially have worked in refugee camps located in Chad, where, as everyone knows, most of those who were able to escape the massacres are now located. We have heard their stories, and we have put our finger on the atrocities which they were victims, with the traces and the documentary traces which they still have. And in these stories that we have heard, Your Honors, the name of the accused has been named many, many times.
Ce nom
This
a
name
été répété à
was
nauseam.
repeated ad nauseum.
Toutes les victimes
All
que nous avons rencontrées
practically all the victims whom we
par les
met
personnes qu'elles considéraient comme
cited
étant
among the
responsables
people whom they considered responsible for what they suffered mentioned
Voilà,
him.
Monsieur le Président, Madame, Monsieur
So,
le juge,
Mr. President, Your Honors,
la qualité de commandant en chef des troupes anti-Balaka de la
The-
Guinée et de notoriété publique.
fact that he was the head of the anti-Balaka is something that is just public knowledge.
Je voulais
And
simplement
so
attirer l'attention de tout le monde
I would like
ici
just to
sur les
draw the
dispositions de
attention
l'article 28
to Article 22 of the Rome Statute.
Je pense que cet article
I think that this
est
article
édifiant
is quite edifying
en ce qui concerne, Monsieur le Président,
with
la responsabilité
Your Honor
en chef.
regard to the responsibility of this
En outre,
chief, this commander-in-chief.
nous nous
Moreover,
référons à la
if we refer to jurisprudence
internationale,
of international jurisdictions,
nous pouvons également noter
we could also note
qu'il n'est pas nécessaire
that
qu'il y ait
it is not
une
necessary
reconnue
to have a highly
autorité de fait
known public authority, but a simple de facto authority in order to speak or evoke responsibility of the commander-in-chief of the troops.
Sur un autre plan, Monsieur
Now,
le Président, Madame, Monsieur les juges,
at another level, Your Honors,
il n'y a aucun doute
there is no doubt
sur les exactions qui ont été
about the
perpétrées par les troupes placées.
atrocities that were conducted by the Salaka troops. The
Tout le monde l'a vu.
TVs across the world have shown this.
Je l'ai
But the
constaté
problem,
au fil de ces audiences,
and I've seen this throughout the hearings,
plusieurs fois, j'ai
is that
entendu
several times I heard
faire référence au
voices referring to the Salaka.
Ce n'est pas ici le débat.
But that is not the debate here. That is not the debate we are having here.
Ce dont il s'agit ici,
What we are debating here
ce sont les crimes commis
are
contre
the
les
crimes
populations musulmanes
committed
de la République
against the Muslim population of the Central African Republic.
Ce que nous cherchons à savoir,
And what we are seeking
c'est
to
qui sont
know
les personnes qui
is
sont
who
responsables
are the
de
people
ces exactions,
responsible for
de notre
these atrocities. That is the purpose of these proceedings.
J'ai effectué plusieurs
I have conducted several field missions
depuis maintenant 5 ans.
for 5 years now.
Mais je dois avouer
And
que,
I
en
must
dépit de mon acharnement
Admit
et de
that
mes
despite
multiples
my
démarches,
efforts and my persistence and all my initiatives, I still have a very hard
je ne
time
parle pas des raisons,
fully outlining. I'm not talking about the reasons, but the outline of all those who were targeted by these atrocities in the Central African Republic in the relevant period.
eu égard à la confusion,
Given the confusion
contradiction
and the contradictions in the terms and explanations,
je puis vous assurer
I can assure you that even today,
de faire la
it is difficult for me to clearly distinguish everything and to see a clear picture.
La seule constante que nous
The
pouvons retenir
only
procède d'un constat
statement that we have
et que les traits communs
observed time and again,
victimes que nous avons rencontrées
and it is a common trait of all the victims we met in Chad, is that they all belong to the Muslim religion.
cette confusion des genres
This
a entraîné le
confusion
massacre
of
de
different
plusieurs
types has
dizaines de
led
milliers
to the massacre of dozens of thousands of people based
physiques et vestimentaires,
on their physical appearance and the way they were dressed.
alors qu'il est
So,
évident que la
or rather, while it is obvious that faith is something that is fundamentally intrinsic.
des personnes
People
qui ont eu la malchance
who
de
unfortunately
s'habiller comme des musulmans ont été
had been
proprement
dressed like Muslims were sacrificed.
Je peux citer ici l'exemple d'un jeune
I can mention as an example a young Senegalese whose parents are or were living in the Central African Republic at the time,
que
and when the events exploded,
il a entrepris le voyage pour aller
He
s'enquérir de la situation de ses parents.
went
Mais
on
nous
a
avons
trip
été
to
atterrés
find out how his parents were doing, and we were floored to hear that he was killed in the street simply because he was dressed in a bubu.
en tenue musulmane.
This is like a Muslim type of dress. This boy who was 18 or 19 years, he paid the cost, paid the price of this killing that was going on. And during the testimonies which we heard,
Également appris que certaines
we
personnes
also
ont échappé à la
learned
mort
that some people were able to escape death by dressing up,
et en mettant le
and
burqa de côté pour
by
s'habiller
putting
en
their
robe
burqa aside
que
to wear another type of clothes in order to escape death.
cela est une véritable catastrophe.
This is a real disaster, a catastrophe.
Monsieur le Président, Madame, Messieurs les juges,
Your Honors,
nous avons entendu
we have heard
dans sa
the
déclaration d'hier
accused in the statement made by him yesterday, giving the reasons that led to the creation of the anti-Balaka troops.
il les a qualifiés de
He
troupes
qualified them as self-defense troops,
et il a considéré
and
que
he
leurs actes
considered that their
relevaient de la
actions
légitime défense.
constituted legitimate self-defense.
C'est vrai, Monsieur le Président.
Your
à
Honor, it
l'origine,
is true that
anti-Balaka avait une
at the
connotation
outset,
traditionnelle.
the anti-Balaka troops had a traditional connotation, but
Et cela,
the reality
personne
is
ne peut
such
le
that,
nier,
and this is something that happened subsequently, no one can
était
deny it,
détourné,
they
manipulé
were deviated,
par des politiciens
manipulated, guided
uniquement
by politicians
combattre un homme,
solely
combattre un régime.
to fight one man, one regime, and have it fall so that another one could take over.
Nous avons
The elements which we have heard here, Your Honor, bear witness to this.
Si nous nous référons
If we refer to the legal notion of legitimate self-defense, Your Honors, the justifications that the accused gave
dans sa déclaration d'hier,
as the basis of his initiative in the statement made yesterday,
nous le savons tous, nous sommes anti-juristes.
we all know, we are all here among lawyers.
Légitime défense, Monsieur
In
le Président,
legitimate self-defense or legitimate defense, there has to be a simultaneity
l'acte et la
between the act and the answer. But if the act is posterior, then this is no longer legitimate defense. This is rather
dans la vengeance. Et c'est exactement
revenge.
ce qui s'est passé.
And that is exactly what happened. I carefully listened to the statement made by the accused yesterday,
Conforte cette idée.
but it strengthens this idea that what happened are acts of reprisal.
Il fallait absolument se venger des actes qui ont
They had to
commis.
get revenge
Et
for what the Seleka troops had done.
furie,
And this fury,
insidieusement, et comme dans la fable,
insidiously and in the
le terme
fable,
Sénéca s'est mué en
the
terme
Seleka, the word Seleka,
si ce n'est pas toi,
began to be the equivalent of Muslim. Muslim.
assisté.
This is exactly what we have seen happen.
Monsieur le Président,
So, Your Honor,
Messieurs les juges,
Your Honors,
La destruction d'un
The
lieu de culte, en l'occurrence
destruction
une mosquée,
of a
ne saurait
religious
en aucun
place of
cas
worship,
être considéré
a
comme
mosque,
un acte de légitime
can
défense.
in no way be considered an act of legitimate
Il en est de même
defense.
pour le
Likewise,
fait de
for
projeter un
acts
fumigène
of
dans
throwing
une
a
maison
smoke bomb
pour en faire sortir les occupants,
onto a house so that the people
en
inside would
n'épargnant même pas les enfants.
come out
Cela ne
to kill
saurait-
them,
ne saurait relever
not even
de
sparing children.
légitime
This
défense.
could never be defined as legitimate defense. It's an act of deliberate reprisals and vengeance. And personally, that's what I gleaned from the statement made yesterday by the
Nous avons
accused.
également
We also
une vidéo, Monsieur le
saw
Président,
a
nous avons
video,
vu ensemble que cette
Your Honor,
personne
a
disait
video of a person saying,
absolument
we
que le
absolutely
président à la tête du pays démissionne, sinon
have to ensure that the president of this country will
c'est effectivement
step down. Otherwise, it will be a massacre. And that is exactly what happened. There was a massacre. We can all bear witness to this because we are regularly in the field.
Monsieur le Président, Madame, Messieurs les juges,
Your Honors,
le fait de dire
the fact of
que je
saying
n'étais pas sur les lieux me
that
semble également être un élément qui ne saurait
I was not
être retenu.
on site, something that
Nous sommes à l'ère
well,
de l'explosion des
we
moyens de communication.
have to take into account because we are in
Il est
a
parfaitement
period
possible
of
de mener des
communication.
Nous
So
sommes dans un monde
you can easily guide troops or govern troops because we live in a virtual world. As the prosecutor's records about communication showed us, you don't have to be in the field in order to
Il me semble également,
guide the troops,
Monsieur le Président,
to lead the troops.
je pense l'avoir entendu.
I think, Your Honor,
Je n'étais pas
you
seul,
have
il y avait
heard,
d'autres.
we all heard him saying,
En matière
I was not alone. There were others. But here, this is a matter of criminal responsibility. It is individual.
de défense,
And it doesn't seem to be a good way to defend oneself in saying, well, I wasn't alone.
Monsieur le Président, ce qui s'est passé
Your Honor, what happened
en République centrale
in the Central African Republic
est quelque chose d'inacceptable.
is something that is unacceptable.
Personne ne peut expliquer
No one can explain the reasons why all these people, most of them innocent, were sacrificed.
Je ne saurais ici passer sans rappeler le
Here,
nom de
I
Madame
have to
Marie-Hélène
talk about what Marie-Hélène Proulx, who is the president of the ICCBA, and I quote her,
les représentants légaux
the
des
legal representatives of victims
dominés par les attentes et les souffrances de leurs clients.
are undermined by the
L'espoir
expectations and suffering of their clients. They are the ones who bear hope for a better future. And this is a very heavy burden, very significant, and it has heavy consequences. And their mandate is a cry in this real trauma of the victims and the universal concept of humanity. This was very, very wise reasoning. I have spent entire days reading and rereading this text because in such a profound and appropriate way,
la situation réelle
it reflects the real situation which we have been living for many years now. It's a situation made up of tears,
de réunions téléphoniques
lamenting
multiples, mais aussi surtout
not only multiple
sans
phone
compter
calls,
les
but
appels
endless ones,
aussi nombreux.
not counting the unexpected and very, very numerous phone calls we have had. So, out of respect for the mandate that the court has given us, we have borne the brunt of all of this. But it is by basing ourselves on this universal concept of humanity, as Madame Prou said, that we have been able to bear all of this. Your Honors, I will have to stop here for the following reasons. The first, Your Honors, is that we have in the observations at the beginning of the hearing, you have drawn our attention to the fact that we had to avoid repeating things, and we do not want to fall into this trap. The second reason, Your Honor, is the Article 68.3 of the legal representatives. There are limits which we cannot overstep. And the third reason is because, as we hear all the time, Your Honor, we are but participants, and we cannot act as another set of prosecutors. That is not our role. Your Honor, we are here to make the voice of the victims heard in this dimension of its views and concerns. Your Honor, I would like to conclude on this note. What has happened in the Central African Republic must never happen again, neither there nor anywhere else in the world. No one has the right to do what has happened, for the simple reason, and as has been said by the French poet Victor Hugo in Acts and Words, the inviolability of human life and the right of rights. We cannot allow ourselves to just liquidate human beings. The only goal of grabbing power. That is just inadmissible. Your Honor, basing ourselves on what we have experienced in the field, what we have heard, and what we have seen, we sincerely think, Your Honor, that there are substantial grounds to believe that the crimes that have been retained in the document with the counts have indeed been committed. And we think also very profoundly, Your Honors, that there are substantive reasons to believe that the accused has himself made it clear that he is responsible for his deeds. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I understand that your colleague will take the floor now. Is that right?
C'est exactement cela, Monsieur le Président.
That is correct, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Then the floor is still with the common legal representative of victims. Thank you.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honors. Good morning to everyone in the courtroom, and good morning to all those guests who have come from afar to listen to us, and to those who are in Bangui in the Central African Republic, and those who are listening to us very carefully. Your Honors, the date of 5 December 2013 is a date that we could call fatal. The capital, Bangui, is one that a part of the army and the anti-Balaka took siege on in order to take power from the Seleka. They failed in reestablishing the constitutional order. The reprisals of the Seleka were obviously very bloody. The revenge of the anti-Balaka at that time then headed to the neighborhoods which in their majority were Muslim, and the latter very quickly became a target, a main target. On 5 December, the Red Cross recorded hundreds of civilian victims who died. There were too many deaths, too many people displaced, too many people who were condemned to forced exile. At the time, the head of the High Commissariat for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, worded it in this way to talk about this tragedy, and I quote, "An ethnic religious cleansing." This is on the 24th of February 2014. Your Honors, Mr. Mokom, who is here today, is an officer of the Central African National Police. He was trained in Libya in charge of intelligence. He was the general coordinator of the anti-Balaka. And yesterday he declared before the pre-trial chamber that the anti-Balaka are patriots, but not for the victims. Nevertheless, this word has been used any which way, and so we have to see what this means, this word anti-Balaka. But in the meantime, this is typically what you see as anti-Balaka, described by a historian who knows, a French historian who knows the history of the Central African Republic, and I quote him, "Anti-Balaka quickly became a catch-all term to designate all those who were adversaries of the regime, the Bouzize clan and the spiteful Falcons, the military who vanished when the Seleka came and who wanted to fight, and a plethora of unemployed, violent, and unstable youth, highway robbers, and members of self-defense groups. One thing united them. They wanted to oust the Muslims, get rid of all the Muslims in the country any which way they could. And I'm quoting Jean-Pierre Ducroix in his book called Ubangi Shari, The Country That Did Not Exist, published by La Découverte in 2021, page 241, 242. I have not seen a better definition for this word. I myself, being from the Central African Republic, and even if I have lived in Paris, and I indirectly and directly have been affected by this matter. The prosecution, in a very precise way, investigated the anti-Balaka actors. And that has made it possible for the OTP to know what they felt. And so the anti-Balaka know very well that they are killing people, because that's what they spend their days doing. These anti-Balaka and their coordinator, who is present here today, are ordinary men, just like we are. And they, several times, have had the opportunity to abstain from killing, but they did not do so. And in the great majority, they preferred to obey. In just a few weeks, creating many victims who were killed straight out, or they were displaced to the enclave called PK5 or abroad. Analyzing the testimony before this court, what we see is an ordinary aptitude of humans to carry out extraordinary inhumanity, as Browning says. Mr. Mokom and those who will support the killing of other human beings are ordinary people. Their days are filled with preparing weapons, mass graves, managing bodies, and training, etc. Victims have told us about the ordinary way in which these people went about these killings. So what does an anti-Balaka think of when killing? That person thinks about himself or herself, about those they will kill. They think about how not to get dirty, about their working conditions, the smell, the blood, to analyze their criminal policy, presumably targeting the Muslim population, and I quote the court, the commission of murders. There are 4 fundamental elements of the theory of criminal personality through the prism of Jean Pinatel. Jean Pinatel says that someone who has a criminal personality is characterized by egocentrism, lability, aggressiveness, and emotional indifference. And we will add one more notion to our dear Browning, that is availability. So, emotional indifference to the fate of others, of Muslims. This is a state of insensitivity and emotional inexpressiveness. It is emotional coldness. With regard to availability, the suspect was not subject to any authority. He is the chief. As the coordinator of the anti-Balaka, he killed or gave the order to kill when he wanted to do so. The victim is not the main goal of the killer. That's not what's of interest to him. The daily life of an anti-Balaka chief is made up of his colleagues, chiefs, how to be heard and how to please. The victim does not count in any way, but the killers know that what they're doing is bad. It is possible that there is no ideological previous mindset. It is not central for the anti-Balaka. Every day, they had to think about how to improve productivity and work,
enterrer le corps.
where to bury the bodies,
Y a-t-il possibilité d'enterrer le corps sur place?
can they bury the
Ou le faire
bodies
monter
on
dans une
site
camionnette
or
pousse-pousse
take a truck or a rickshaw to bury them in the mass grave.
témoignage
These were testimonies
d'une victime
of a victim
qui faisait semblant d'être mort,
who
qui écoutait
played dead
ce qui se passait.
and who was hearing everything that was going on.
Monsieur le Président, Madame,
Your
Monsieur
Honors,
le juge, le document de confirmation des charges a rappelé
the
la
document of
gravité
the confirmation of the charges confirmed the gravity of the crimes committed.
de masse perpétrée
There
par un
are
certain
crimes,
nombre d'individus
these are mass crimes perpetrated
dans une
by a certain
situation
number of individuals
totalement
in a
déséquilibrée
situation that is
avec
completely
ceux qui
unbalanced
possèdent des armes
between
contre
those
ceux
who
qui n'en ont
possess
pas, et
weapons
qu'on va abattre
vis-à-vis
à la
those
chaîne.
who do not have any and who
Centaines,
will
voire des
be
milliers d'individus.
murdered systematically.
En utilisant des
See,
outils locaux,
hundreds,
la mise
even
à mort,
thousands of individuals,
machettes,
and what was used were
coutelas,
local tools for killing, machetes,
etc.
knives, hunting, or war weapons.
ne concerne pas seulement le sort
The
des
horror
enlevés,
is not just about the fate of the victims, but
conditions de vie, à
the
savoir
conditions of life, namely
conditions de travail
working
qui deviennent
conditions
de plus en plus
that
dures,
are becoming more and more difficult,
de plus en
more and
plus
more
fatigantes,
difficult to endure, more tiring, whether it be killing people on a
que ce
daily
soit
basis,
d'enterrer les corps,
managing
que ce
bodies,
soit la senteur,
the
l'odeur,
odor,
les cris,
the smell, the cries that become
intolérables, et qui est précisément
unbearable,
ce dont parlent les
and
auteurs de ces crimes.
this is precisely what
En
these
réalité,
perpetrators of these crimes are talking about this. But the reality
et le
is
préjudice
that
causé
the impact of the crime and the harm caused to the victims and their families are of an exceptional gravity.
en pareil cas,
In such a
on peut
case,
rappeler la position
we
de la
have to
Chambre
recall the position of the pretrial chamber,
qui s'est alignée sur
which
les
aligned
décisions
itself
des tribunaux ad hoc,
on the jurisprudence of ad hoc tribunals, namely, and I quote,
la
the
gravité
gravity
requiert
requires taking into account
toutes les données
all
factuelles,
factual data,
et notamment
and
la
namely
nature de l'acte,
the nature of the act or of the omission, the context in which it took
la
place,
situation
the
personnelle
personal
de la
situation of the victim,
victime, ainsi que
as
les
well
effets
as the
mentaux et moraux de
physical,
l'acte
mental,
sur la victime.
and moral effects of the act on the victim.
Chambre de jugement
This is the TPIC Second Chamber Vasilevich judgment,
Autrement dit, il ressort de cette
IT
jurisprudence de l'approche
9832T 29 November 2002.
concrète
In other
correspond aux
words,
circonstances
the
liées
jurisprudence shows that the qualitative approach of the specific gravity corresponds to the circumstances linked to the commission of the crimes.
est partie
And
au Kosovo,
this is
qui a
an
fait le
eminent
commentaire de
jurist
l'article 53 du statut de Rome.
who commented on the Article 53 of the Rome Statute, Mr. Biti Gilbert. These grave crimes must not go
Et
unpunished.
l'impunité, Monsieur le
Impunity,
Président,
Mr. President, Your Honors,
l'impunité est un
impunity
élément
is
de
an
la
element
réconciliation.
of reconciliation in the Central African
Une
Republic
occasion pour les
and
victimes
an opportunity for victims to grieve.
Monsieur le Président, Madame le juge,
Your Honors,
Madame et Monsieur le juge, les préoccupations des victimes,
the concerns of the victims,
si les charges sont retenues,
if the charges
sont les
are
suivantes.
retained, are the following.
Ils demandent un délai raisonnable,
They are asking for a reasonable time frame,
une juste indemnisation,
fair
du préjudice,
compensation for the harm done,
car la situation
because the situation, the security situation rather,
aujourd'hui en
today
République
in the
centrafricaine
Central African Republic
est évidemment
is obviously one that is creating difficulty
tant dans leur
for the
quotidien,
victims in their daily
elles
lives.
ne peuvent pas se projeter pour l'éventuel.
They are unable to look forward and even envision reparations. With the palpable tensions in the current context, with the Wagner Company mercenaries present and the presence of all kinds of rebels in the hinterland, what can be the fate of these victims in the case of reprisals, rather of a resumption of hostilities and massacres? In this respect, they have asked the legal representatives about measures that would be taken to avoid destruction and looting of what remains of their property and dignity. Earlier, my colleague cited the buildings, for example, out of many mosques at the U.S. Embassy at the UN. Many, over 400 have been destroyed in the country. What is the fate of property in terms of diamonds, gold, etc.? Those Muslims who lost all this that has been spoliated, stolen, appropriated. What is the fate of all this? Those who are collecting these kaho, says the speaker. Mr. Abobango, who's dead of a heart attack, he was the richest of all the diamond collectors, Eber Barati and others. What about the Yaloke collectors in Berbere? So, Mr. President, with these observations and arguments, Your Honors, the ICC is a pedagogical tool, and the judges are using it to change prejudices and attitudes of people who are interacting and who have a responsibility to protect citizens. The court can also be a tool of prevention that could avoid situations that would cause considerable emotional and traumatic distress. The victims in the Central African Republic, Bosangoa, Goberi, Njo, Bosamtele, Pwali, Yaloke, Karno, and Berberati, and also to mention Bangui and others, are listening to us. They hear us, they see us, thanks to social networks and TV. They can follow us everywhere, and this is closely being monitored, Your Honor. And the victims in Garambulai in Cameroon, in Betre, Yaoundé, and Douala, all these people are following us very, very carefully. Victims of Chad, Jamena, Gore, Dose, Doba, Mundu, etc. The court has not forgotten you and will take you out of this closed space you have been assigned to. In terms of those who are in PK5, they have relative peace, but don't forget they were attacked. 58 attacks that have been documented, recorded. So, Mr. President, I will conclude on that note, and I thank you.
I also want to thank the victims who took time to listen to me because they didn't have the resources to be here. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, sir. Do we have other speakers? Yes, madam, the floor is yours then.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Your Honors, I rise once again. I am Duzima Marie-Edith, Central African Bar, and I rise this time simply to express the feelings of the victims relating to the harm suffered following what happened to them. Mr. President, ordinarily,
les criminels, lorsqu'ils agissent,
when criminals act,
comme souvent on l'a entendu,
as
prétendent défendre les autres
we have heard, they
contre, les
sometimes
agresseurs.
claim that they are defending others
Cependant, ces
against
mêmes criminels
attackers.
persécutent
But
encore
at the same time,
les personnes
these criminals
qu'ils
go
sont
on to
censés défendre.
persecute those whom they
Oh.
claim to be defending.
Ils profitent d'une situation
They
donnée
take advantage
pour
of a
mettre en
specific
exergue
situation
leur agenda caché.
to highlight their
Pour ce
hidden
faire,
agendas.
Leur premier outil,
And
c'est la manipulation.
in order to achieve this, their first tool is manipulation.
Je vais donner un exemple.
I can give you
C'est que
an
depuis son
example.
indépendance en 1960,
from the time of its independence in
les musulmans et
1960.
les chrétiens ont toujours vécu en
Muslims
harmonie dans ce
and
pays.
Christians always
Il y a
lived
même des mariages
harmoniously
confessionnels,
in our country.
mais parce que
There was marriage
il y a eu un
between
changement
the religious
à la
groups,
tête du pays
but when
et que le président
a certain
pouvait être un
change
musulman,
occurred at the helm of the country
composé en
and the
majorité
president
des musulmans,
became a Muslim, and the Seleka was mainly a Muslim
ces
movement,
combattants
then the
anti-Balaka,
anti-Balaka fighters
leurs ennemis,
were brought or made to understand that their enemy was
les
the
ONG
Seleka.
internationales ont épousé
International NGOs embraced that
Human
hypothesis,
Rights Watch.
including Human Rights Watch.
Au cours de l'année
But
2014,
subsequently, in 2014,
écrit
Human Rights
le conflit
Watch
en Centrafrique,
wrote
le conflit qui a débuté en 2013,
the following, that the
musulmans et
conflict in the Central African Republic that began in 2013 was not a conflict between
la violence
Muslims and Christians.
constitue le raccourci
Secondly, violence is the
sans songer
shortcut
aux
or the,
conséquences
to
néfastes
achieving this
indélébiles pour les victimes.
goal without taking into consideration the nefarious consequences on the victims. Now, when these people become somewhat
Deviennent
bothered,
des agneaux,
they suddenly morph into victims and become lambs,
mais comme mes confrères l'ont dit
justifying
tout à l'heure,
their
ils s'enfoncent
actions.
davantage.
But like my learned colleague has just pointed out, in so doing, in attempting to justify their actions, they further implicate themselves. They reject everything in mass or in one swoop and refuse to repent. But Mr. President, you know very well that there is no smoke without fire. So what
De nombreuses personnes
would the interest be for so many
pour aller se
people
plaindre d'avoir
to
été
rise up
victimes
and
de
complain
tel ou tel crime
that they were victims of such and such a case
demander justice.
and ask for justice,
Ces victimes ne se connaissent pas, Monsieur le Président.
whereas these
Les
victims I'm
formulaires-
referring
les
to, do
formulaires
not
de
know themselves.
participation sont individuels.
Mr. President, application forms for participation in the trial are individual
Peut
forms.
décrire
How
les mêmes
can
faits
anyone in
une
Bangui
victime de
describe
Boussangoa.
the same facts in the same manner as a victim from
Les événements
Bosangoa?
de décembre 2013
You see, the event
sont
of
déroulés
December
presque au même moment
2013
à Bangui.
happened more or less at
à
about the
Bosangoa.
same time in Bangui and in Bosangoa.
Or, les récits, surtout
And the
concernant
narratives
le mode
of
opérationnel,
the victims, particularly when it comes to
d'une
the
victime à une autre.
modus operandi, are similar from one victim to the next.
Il y a eu beaucoup de privations de liberté.
There was
Pour
the
cela,
privation of liberty,
je vais citer
and I want to
des victimes qui
mention
ont dit à peu près la même
a
chose.
number of victims who
Les victimes A,
said more or less the same thing.
087/22,
Victim A,
A, 70
7102,
22,
victim A, 71
090
008/22, Mr. President, the speaker is going too fast and we don't have the material.
Madam, kindly slow down.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm sorry.
Le fait
The fact is that
de procéder à l'enlèvement
when
par
a parent is abducted or a relative is abducted and taken to the Nyamwara school, particularly as was the case in Bangui,
de procéder à l'enlèvement
the fact
de leurs parents
that
et de les transférer à l'école Liberté
their relatives were transported to the École Liberté or parents to École de Liberté and that they subsequently disappeared. And to this day, 9 years after,
Bien, Monsieur le Président,
nothing is known.
il s'agit bel et
Well,
bien
Mr. President, it is
privation
clear
de liberté
that this
qui est punie
is a loss of liberty
le statut de Rome.
which is punishable under the Rome Statute.
Concernant les conditions de vie actuelles,
When
Monsieur
it
le
comes to
Président,
the current
je
conditions
vais insister
of living
sur les conséquences néfastes
of the victims, Mr. President, let me
parce qu'il s'agit
insist
de viols
on the
collectifs
negative consequences of rape. I am referring here to group or collective rape
Il s'agit
in most
de problèmes de
cases.
santé,
These
en
problems
particulier-
include,
en particulier
number one,
gynécologiques
health
chez les
problems,
femmes
gynecological problems that
après
women
leur viol collectif.
and girls experience after
Beaucoup d'entre elles
having
parlent
been
de dépression,
collectively raped.
de cauchemar,
A lot of them
de
have
stress,
talked about depression, nightmares, and stress and anguish.
Président, en Afrique
Mr.
en
President,
général,
in Africa
Centrafrique en particulier,
in general, and more specifically in the Central African Republic, rape
que vous êtes
is a
victime de
taboo.
viol,
When
vous êtes
one is a
stigmatisé.
victim of rape,
Vous n'êtes-
one
vous ne faites
is
plus
stigmatized.
de la communauté.
One no longer
Vous êtes rejeté par
belongs
votre
to the
propre
community.
mari.
Your community and your husband, rather,
Pourquoi? Parce que
would reject you
violé,
simply because you have been raped.
considéré comme
And
souillé,
because you have been raped, you are considered to be dirty and you are no longer
constituez votre vie.
yourself. You have to build back
Quand
your life.
stigmatisé,
You see,
vous ne
when
pouvez plus vivre
one
normalement
is
comme les autres.
so stigmatized, one can no longer lead a normal life as other persons. Mr. President,
Autre conséquence du viol,
another consequence of rape
c'est que
is the following.
vous n'avez plus envie d'avoir des rapports sexuels.
The rape victim no longer feels the desire for sexual relations with a man.
Concernant le meurtre,
Turning to murder,
en Afrique en général et en Centrafrique en particulier,
Mr. President, in Africa
une seule
and
personne
particularly in the Central African Republic,
peut avoir à sa charge
an individual may
plus d'une dizaine de personnes.
be responsible
Les
for
victimes
more than 10
directes
persons.
ont laissé entendre
In this regard,
la personne qui a été
the indirect victims of these
le
crimes
pilier
have informed us that
du coup.
when a pillar of a family has been killed, what happens instantly is that the children
La famille
can no longer
ne peut plus
attend school. Instantly,
se restaurer,
the family
avoir à manger
no longer has food
tous les jours.
on a daily basis.
La famille est réduite à la pauvreté,
The
à
family
la mendicité.
slumps into poverty and they become
Concernant
beggars.
les conséquences du pillage,
Now, turning to
la
looting
destruction de
and
biens,
its consequences, as well as the destruction of property. Mr. President, Your Honors,
Comment faire
how
lorsque vous êtes obligé
does
à
one
cause des conflits,
deal with
à cause de
a situation arising
de fuir
because of the conflict
votre quartier, de
and
fuir
because of the war,
au moment de l'alcool,
in which one has to flee one's neighborhood and one's
vous n'avez
country?
plus de maison.
When calm has returned and you go back home, you no longer have a house
Votre maison existe,
because it has been destroyed.
mais ce n'est plus à vous.
Or your house might
Cette
still be
maison est
standing,
occupée
but it no longer belongs to you because those who initially hurt you have occupied the house. How do you deal with that? How do you resume an ordinary life, normal livelihood?
Voilà autant de
Mr. President,
de ce qui est arrivé.
those are the several consequences that these victims experienced. And they are calling for
Rendu.
justice to be done for
Monsieur
them.
le Président,
Mr. President,
nous avons évité le génocide
we
parce que finalement,
were spared a genocide
les Centrafricains ont compris
because in the end,
ce qu'il y a derrière
Central Africans understood
cette manipulation.
what the motives behind the manipulation were and what
Il y a eu
was
dislocation des familles.
behind the conflict. It is true that families were
Il y a des familles
dislocated.
qui ont été obligées
Some
de louer des maisons
families were forced
et qu'ils n'arrivent pas à
to rent houses,
Beaucoup d'entre eux ont été
but
expulsés.
were unable to pay the rent and were therefore thrown out and thus became vulnerable.
Ils veulent connaître la vérité.
Today, the victims want to know the truth about what transpired.
Pourquoi moi?
They want to know why.
Qu'est-ce que j'ai fait?
Why me? What did I
Monsieur
do?
le Président,
Mr.
Madame
President,
la
Your Honors,
ça sera lorsque les victimes vont connaître la vérité.
it
ça
is
sera un
only
début,
when the victims would have known the truth
début de solution.
that big reparations would have started, that some kind of solution would have been initiated, and some comfort would have been brought to the victims so that they can live again and build their lives again and have some measure of consolation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam. Floor is for next representative of the Common Legal Representative of Victims. Go ahead, ma'am. Go ahead.
Je commence. Bonjour, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour, Madame le juge. Bonjour, Monsieur le juge. Maître Rabé Sandratana. Pour terminer nos propos d'aujourd'hui sur le fond, je vais vous parler d'une charge dont on a déjà parlé, mais vous faire essayer.
Excuse me, Madam. Hold on a second, because we have a problem with interpretation.
My microphone was switched off. I'm sorry.
All right. Would you kindly start all over again so we can get interpretation? There was a technical issue. Thank you very much, Madam.
Bien. Pour terminer nos propos.
Good morning. I want to conclude our argument on the merit this morning, Mr. President, Your Honors, by referring
D'une charge
to a
qui a déjà
charge
été abordé,
which was somewhat
que l'on peut
broached,
approfondir
but
du
which
point de vue des
we
victimes.
may want to delve
qu'il y
into
a
further
énormément de
from a
choses
victim's point of
à
view, because there is a
à
lot
faire comprendre
that
aussi
can be said about that
l'opinion
charge,
publique.
to transmit
Donc je voudrais
and to,
aborder le thème
so to speak, expose to the
et du
general
transfert
public.
forcé
I want to talk about deportation and forced transfers
Et
of
pour
civilian
ce faire,
populations.
J'illustrerai
I will
ceci
illustrate this point
par la situation
by
des
referring
victimes
to the
dans les
situation
camps.
of the victims
Ces
in
déplacements
camps.
forcés, ces transferts de population,
The deportations and forced transfers of
de la situation
the
des
populations
victimes
can be
réfugiées dans les camps du
talked
Tchad.
about in terms of the victims who
Ces
are
victimes,
refugees in camps in
elles
Chad.
viennent de Bangui,
Those
de
victims
Bossangoa,
come from
de
Bangui,
Berberati,
from Bosangwa, from
on vous l'a
Berberati,
expliqué, de Mbeki,
and from
de
Baiki,
Lalobaye, de
from
Yaloké,
Lalobai, from
Carnot,
Yaloke, from
et
Carno,
de
and
une
from
plurielle de petits
a
villages
host of
de la
other
Beauce.
small
Pour la très
villages
grande majorité,
here and there,
comme vous pouvez
as you have
l'imaginer,
already been told.
il s'agit de
Most
femmes,
of them, as you can imagine, are mostly
les époux,
women and children,
parents, frères ont
spouses,
été tués.
relatives, brothers,
De
parents
nationalité
were killed.
centrafricaine,
Their nationality
la plupart.
is mostly Central African,
Et avant leur
most of
expulsion,
whom were born in the Central African
ils
Republic.
représentaient
Before
la
they were
deuxième
expelled,
génération,
they represented
la
the
troisième
second
génération
and even
de
the
personnes
third generation
d'origine tchadienne.
of people who were of Chadian
Ces
origin.
victimes se sentent profondément
These victims
centrafricaines,
feel
mais aux
deeply
yeux des
to
Antilles
be
à la carte,
Central Africans.
leur
But
appartenance
in the eyes
religieuse
of the Antibalaka, their
fait d'elles des
religious
personnes étrangères,
belonging
des
meant
ennemis.
that they were foreigners and therefore
Cette
enemies.
fameuse manipulation
So we have talked
vient de vous entretenir.
about manipulation, the
En
infamous
2014,
manipulation.
Le rapport
You see, in
de la commission
2014,
interministérielle
the Interministerial
chargée
Commission
du recensement
on the
de ces
census
personnes,
of these people,
mise en place par
and
le
this commission
gouvernement
was
du Tchad
set
de
up
l'époque,
by the government of Chad at the time,
qu'au mois de juin
reported as
2014,
follows, that in June
entre décembre,
2014,
5 décembre
that is between the 5th of
juin
December
2014,
2013 and June 2014,
10 000
some 10,000
dans les
victims,
sites de confinement
10,000 of them
le
resided
long de la
in
frontière
those
dans la région du
spaces
Moyen-Chari,
that were
le site de
created
Sido,
at the borders
le site
along
de
the
Doya,
Chari River,
avec des enfants
including
bien
sites
accompagnés,
such
des
as
administratifs,
Sido,
des enfants
Yari, including
orphelins,
children,
337
unaccompanied children
étaient recensés en
without
juin
families, and so on and so forth. 337 of them were identified in June. In
le site de Gorée,
Western Logon,
le site de
at
Doha,
Gore and Doba
671
sites,
enfants
671 unaccompanied children were identified
enregistrés,
and
le site de
recorded
Bitol,
at
en Logogne
Mbital in the
occidentale,
western Logogne
Mundu.
and in
Mundu,
Mundu.
c'est un site
That
de
site
transit
in Mundu was a
des gens
transit site
passés par le
at which
Cameroun,
people would go through
autre pays
Cameroon,
frontalier commun
which is a
à la République
neighboring
centrafricaine
country which shares border
et au Tchad.
with the Central African
Sans
Republic
oublier
and Chad.
N'Djamena.
And then there was also N'Djamena, the capital.
Ces personnes, c'était des commerçants,
All these people included traders,
des artisans,
collectors,
des éleveurs de bétail,
artisans,
C'était des gens qui faisaient vivre
herdsmen,
l'économie
cattle
de la Centrafrique.
breeders, and all types of business
Certaines
people
femmes
who
avaient un statut
were
social,
active in the Central
avaient
African
une
economic
autonomie
system.
financière.
Some
Parce
of
qu'elles
the
étaient
women
commerçantes
had a social
elles-mêmes.
status. They had businesses and they were traders themselves.
Où elles étaient
Or
femmes
they
ménagères
were housewives,
avec à la maison une certaine jouissance, une certaine
enjoying
aisance.
some
Et d'autres,
comfort and ease in their
petits
homes.
commerces,
Some of them were
alimentaires.
petty traders in foodstuff. Some of them did
Mais
little jobs here and there.
en plus d'avoir perdu leur famille
But they lost their families.
par tout ce que l'on vient de vous expliquer,
Following
à
what
la suite
has
de
just
ces
been
meurtres et de ces massacres,
explained to the court
aujourd'hui,
following those
elles sont
murders and
privées
massacres. These women today have lost
sociales.
every measure of social
Elles ont
existence.
perdu
They have lost
leur dignité.
their dignity.
Elles demeurent dans
They
des camps, vivant
stay
dans
in
des zones
camps,
excentrées,
in
dans des
areas
conditions
that
déplorables,
are far off
sans
and
soins,
under deplorable living
sans école
conditions,
pour les enfants.
with no access
Ou
to
s'il en
health
existe,
and to schools for their children,
c'est sous une
and
certaine
where
précarité.
such access
Parce que
were even
financé
available,
par
it is
Des
precarious
aides
because
extérieures,
it is based on
humanitaires,
external humanitarian
ces
funding.
programmes.
And you know what these problems are
Donc,
all
c'est
about,
par là
especially
qu'il va y
when it
avoir
comes
une
to
école
women.
élémentaire,
A school might be dotted here
une autre
and there,
école,
and then
et la
another
plupart du
one
temps,
here and
il
there,
n'y a pas d'école.
a primary school, but most of the time
Sans
there are
soins,
no schools at all.
Sans école,
So,
sans argent,
without a house, without a school,
Survivre.
without money, without health,
grâce à l'aide
and
humanitaire.
when one survives
Ces
only
femmes
on
Sont
humanitarian
doublement
aid,
victimes.
this means that these
Elles se
women
retrouvent,
are victimized,
comme on vient de vous
twice.
l'expliquer, à devoir élever
as has
les
been
enfants.
explained to you.
orphelins
They now have to
de leurs
raise
frères, de
orphans,
leurs sœurs, de leurs parents.
the children of their brothers and their
Cousins,
sisters,
cousines.
and their parents, their relatives,
Elles sont
their
elles-mêmes
cousins,
particulièrement
and so on and
vulnérables.
so forth. Whereas they themselves remain particularly
de le
vulnerable,
dire,
as
lorsqu'elles ont subi
you have just
des
been
violences
told,
sexuelles.
particularly
pour
after
ces femmes,
they have been
pour ces
victims
veuves,
of sexual
oui,
rape.
C'est la double
These
peine.
women, these widows,
Il
suffer
leur faut un courage
double harm,
extraordinaire.
and they need
Cette
extraordinary
situation des
courage.
victimes que je vous décris
This
comme étant
situation
au Tchad,
of the victims that I
n'est pas
have
une
described to
situation
you
isolée.
pertaining to the victims in the
concerne
camps in Chad
Des milliers
is
de
not
Centrafricains
an
confinés
isolated
dans les quartiers différents,
narrative.
dans les enclaves.
It relates to several
Sophie, bien
other
sûr, m'amène
hundreds of Central
à
Africans
aborder
in
rapidement
various enclaves in different
la question
locations.
des préjudices
And that now
subis
brings me
par l'ensemble
to
des
the
victimes.
issue of
Elles
the
sont condamnées
harm
à survivre
suffered by all
dans
the
des
victims
conditions
who
déplorables,
are condemned
favorisant
to
la
suffer
propagation
in
des maladies,
unbearable
argent
conditions
bénéficier de soins.
where
Elles ont subi et
disease
souffrent
spreads,
toujours
where there
des
is no
dommages
money.
physiques,
They
des
continue
dommages
to suffer physical and
des dommages
moral
physiques,
damage
on
or
vient
harm.
de vous les énumérer,
The physical
d'eau, de nourriture,
harm
soins
they suffer
médicaux,
has been described to you.
atteinte à leur
No water,
intégrité
no
physique.
health,
Il y a déjà
no
des-
medication,
beaucoup de décès,
injury to their
des dommages
dignity,
moraux,
deaths in the
parce qu'elles ont
camps,
été témoins de
moral
massacres,
damage because they were
d'où des cauchemars,
eyewitnesses
traumatismes
to
psychologiques,
killings,
des
psychological
humiliations,
trauma, humiliation,
stigmatisation,
stigma, and what have you.
dommages matériels.
Material loss,
Les foyers ont été
homes
détruits
that were destroyed and abandoned. They have no subsistence resources any longer. They have no resources any longer. And they therefore no longer give value to their own lives. All this harm and prejudice has not yet been processed. It is not too late to deal with them, particularly when it comes to psychological trauma. It is important because these people are in exile. They are removed from their roots in the Central African Republic. They have no place to transplant their roots. And even those who may have that possibility, for them, it still remains a very fragile transplantation. How can you take ownership of land which has been forced upon you? You have been cut off from your roots and you have been replanted forcibly on another piece of land. All of that in a context of war and violence. These people, these victims, they become disconnected from their cultures. And this is extremely difficult. It is almost impossible to ensure that future generations will remain connected. My message is to tell you that it is important for these adults, these victims, regardless of their age, need to find some peace by finding settlement in their emotions, by narrating their story, the story of their families, and the transformations that their families have gone through in a manner that can be transmitted and in a manner that deals with feelings of revenge and violence and injustice. That is it. That is what happened in the Central African Republic. This country, which at the time of its creation and even subsequently was proud of its ethnic diversity, its cultural diversity, and its religious diversity. During the National Day celebrations, it was often recalled that it was absolutely important to preserve national unity and social cohesion and peace. Mr. President, Your Honors, and those of us in the courtroom, as well as those listening to us, this is where we find ourselves today, in 2023, dealing with the fate of this civilian population that has been displaced. All they want is a simple thing, a little bit of well-being, the ability to live well, so that their daily lives may be peaceful and so that they may have peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam. You're done? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, then the submissions on the merits of the common legal representative of victims are finished. Small clarification. The first speaker on behalf of the victims, Maître Fall, referred in the French transcript to Article 28. Then this was reported as Article 22 in the English transcript. This will be aligned, but also referred to responsibility of the Commander-in-Chief. This is just to clarify that in the document containing the charge, it is not alleged that Mr. Mokom was the Commander-in-Chief, and there is no charge under the mode of liability of Article 28. This is, of course, without prejudice to any decision that the Chamber may take eventually, but this is just to clarify that it is not alleged in the DCC, none of the two, neither Article 28 nor that Mr. Mokom was the Commander-in-Chief of the anti-Balaka, as you have said. This is just for the records.
Your Honor, I realize it's my turn. With your leave, could we take the half-hour break now so I could shuffle my papers around and be ready to start at 11:20 and to go until the lunch break? With your leave.
Yes, absolutely. We do this. We will reconvene in 30 minutes at 11:25. Thank you very much.
Much grateful, Your Honor.
All rise. We will agree.